let me introduce our presenters today. Today we'll be hearing from Eirik Nyhus. He's our Director for the Environment at DNV Maritime, and Tore Longba, who's our Director for Decarbonisation. Now, before we begin, let's have a quick look at the agenda. We'll be looking at the new GHG emissions regulations, then the onboard CCS, as well as air pollution and energy efficiency topics, and finally, so a look at the ballast water management regs that came in as well. Then we'll have our Q&A session and finish up for the day. So without any further delay, let's hop on over to our first presenter. Eirik, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Simon. We will, as Simon mentioned, be talking about MEPC 81, and the focus will be on greenhouse gas matters. I will start off by giving a rundown essentially of the big picture things on the table here, and not least the politics of what is happening negotiation-wise. Tore will then dive into some of the more nitty-gritty details on quite important topics as we move along here. So let's just get into a little bit of nostalgia here first. Just to set the scene, this is a picture taken not at MEPC 81 but at MEPC 80, where we adopted the IMO's greenhouse gas strategy to great acclaim and great enthusiasm, shall I say, by all the delegates present. I would emphasize that at the time of adoption, this was universal. There were no reservations. Everybody in the IMO family stands behind the greenhouse gas strategy as adopted. And that leads us into a quick recap on what the greenhouse gas strategy is before we head into the status quo on the attendant regulatory work. We, back in 2023, sounds like a long time ago now, did manage to significantly strengthen the IMO's greenhouse gas strategy. It is now clearly defined with an ultimate decarbonization goal for international shipping set to 2050. There is a little bit of, shall we say, softness of wording if you really want to dive into the exact phraseology in the strategy, but for all intents and purposes, we can treat 2050 as the year when shipping is supposed to attain net zero greenhouse gas emissions. It should also be mentioned that this is a target in a well-to-wake context, meaning that you're taking into account not only what happens when fuels get burned on the ship, but what also happens in the extraction, production, refining, transportation, etc. phases of any given fuel, i.e. what happens before it gets on board the ship. So the entire life cycle of fuel or energy production is taken into account here. The IMO also recognized at the time that just having an end state is not adequate. You have to have intermediate checkpoints. So we have a target for 2040 of a 70% reduction and a target for 2030 of a 20% reduction. Both of these are written in a way that we should actually strive for 10 percentage points more in each case, but 20% and 70% is of course quite significant goals in and of themselves. In addition, we have a target for 2030 of a 5% uptake of zero or near zero greenhouse gas technologies, fuels and or energy sources. This is a quite significant add-on to the overarching reduction target. Now, all of these targets are, of course, linked to a baseline, and the base year we have is 2008. And a quirk here is that the numbers we have for 2008 are essentially defined in a tank-to-wake metric. So we don't rightly have the exact well-to-wake numbers for 2008 yet. They are likely to be produced as part of a fifth IMO greenhouse gas study. But as a rule of thumb, you can essentially take the tank-to-wake figures from 2008 and add 15% or so on top of those, and you'll be at least in a very small ballpark. So recap, we had this strategy at MEPC 80. It was not up for discussion at MEPC 81, and no one was attempting to backtrack or reduce the ambition levels or anything like that. There is universal acceptance and agreement that this is the strategy IMO is working towards. So a strategy, of course, is only a policy document in a sense, an important one, but still it's a policy. It sets a direction on where we want to go. To actually get where we want to go, we need regulations that are binding, are enforceable, and have real and meaningful actions being taken to comply with them. MEPC 81 was thus focused on those next generation regulations, the new ones that are incoming. We do, of course, have the CII, we have the SEMP, we have the EEXI and the EEDI, and I'll get back to the CII, or rather Tore will get back to the CII, but the focus this time was really on the new regulations that were agreed at MEPC 80 that we should have as a part of a basket of measures. These regulations are intended to enter into force in 2027. And when you back calculate the way that IMO makes regulations, this means that they need to be approved at MEPC 83 in 2025 and be adopted at an extraordinary session of the MEPC in October 2025. So we need to have something ready for approval 1 year down the road from now. There are two elements to what we were discussing. The discussions here build on the agreement at MEPC 80, and since we, of course, as mentioned, have approval still a year or so ahead of us, no key political decisions were made at this meeting. It was all about seeking convergence and understanding amongst the parties of the proposals that are on the table. And there were a number of different proposals, and there were quite robust discussions for the 2 weeks we were discussing greenhouse gas matters. First and foremost, though, I just want to describe quickly what they are. We have a so-called technical element. This is a greenhouse gas fuel intensity standard that sets a technical requirement to the greenhouse gas footprint that the fuel can have. That is, when it is combusted, you look at the grams CO2 equivalent per energy unit and use that as the metric to determine a reduction trajectory of that value. So that means you start at, say, a requirement of 90 grams CO2 equivalent per energy unit, and you decline towards potentially 0 in 2050 if there is agreement that that should be the reduction trajectory. So it's an increasing tightening of the requirement to the fuel, and this will drive the uptake of low intensity fuels and essentially contribute towards phasing out high intensity, i.e. conventional fuels, as time goes by. The second element that's part of the discussions at the IMO is the economic element. And the economic element really can be said to consist of two elements here. One is you can have a flexibility element internal to the greenhouse gas fuel intensity standard, so that you can sort of balance out compliance between over-complying and under-complying ships through, for instance, a pool mechanism. That kind of balancing mechanism can be associated with financial reimbursement of different kinds. Thus, there will be a financial element if that aspect is included in the final outcome of the IMO's deliberations. The second economic element would be a direct price on greenhouse gas emissions, i.e. a mechanism external to the greenhouse gas fuel intensity standard. A levy would be one example of such a mechanism, and is really the one external mechanism that was subject to considerable discussion at MEPC 81. And as mentioned, we're looking for adoption in late 2025, entry into force in 2027, most likely the regulation then becoming effective as of 1st of January 2028, so that will be decided at the time of adoption. So to dive into some of the more technical details or political details on where we stand with respect to the various options on the table. When it comes to the GFI, the Greenhouse Gas Fuel Intensity Standard, there are two core proposals on the table. And this is not to downplay the other proposals that are there, because we have several proposals for numerous countries. But during the discussions, the debate tended to center around two key proposals when it came to the GFI aspect. And that is a proposal by the EU with the co-sponsors going for a direct well-to-wake metric, essentially applying the IMO's LCA guideline. Tore will be talking a little bit more about what's happening with that, and setting a direct criteria to the well-to-wake footprint that is acceptable for fuels to be used on board ships. The second proposal is put forward by China with co-sponsors from both Latin America and Europe, rather Norway, still a European country. And this is a tank-to-wake proposal, but I must emphasize that here it's not a pure tank-to-wake proposal. It is intended to underpin the well-to-wake the well-to-wake strategic goals by adding in factors dependent on the categorization on the well-to-tank and sustainability criteria of the fuels in question. In essence, you take a tank-to-wake approach, but you then weight your calculations depending on the well-to-tank performance of the fuel in question. What that means is that both of these proposals will be underpinning the IMO's well-to-wake greenhouse gas strategic approach. Now, why such a convoluted addition to a tank-to-wake approach? This goes back to politics, essentially. And we have the situation where some countries have various red lines during negotiations. And in this case, China has a very bright red line when it comes to applying well-to-wake criteria to shipping regulations. They're fine doing it on a strategic level, in a strategy, but on the regulatory level, the view is that what goes on a ship should be focused on the ship itself. That means what happens when it comes to fuel production on shore should be dealt with through other instruments, such as the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change negotiations, the COP meetings, nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, or mechanisms like that. This is a political question, and it is one of the more challenging ones for the IMO to deal with. But again, I stress, both of these approaches can be designed to fully support the IMO's greenhouse gas strategy. The second significant issue here is whether or not the final outcome of the IMO negotiations should have flexibility provisions. Flexibility provisions would be, for instance, pooling in this sense, or the ability to purchase and sell compliance units within the mechanisms. Both the EU's proposal and the China et al. Proposal do have flexibility provisions built in, but there are a number of countries that view flexibility as something that will lead to greater costs for developing countries, and therefore are very skeptical to this issue. I think it's solvable, but again, yet another very political question that needs to be resolved as we move forward ahead with these negotiations. And then the final issue when it comes to the GFI is whether it's adequate to have an integrated economic instrument, or if a separate economic instrument should be added. And here there's also divergence between parties. The EU is firm in its view that a separate additional economic instrument is needed on top of the internal mechanism, whereas China and some of the co-sponsors, but not all, believe that the integrated economic instrument is adequate to satisfy the IMO's requirement for an economic mechanism in the so-called basket of measures. Again, yet another very political thing that it needs significant work to sort out. Now, that brings us to the separate economic instrument, the levy. To levy or not to levy, as I kind of tongue-in-cheek phrase it here. And here we see a significant divide between countries. As mentioned, we have Europe Plus, as I call them, that is the supporters of the EU proposals. They broadly see a levy as a necessary supplemental mechanism to the GFI itself, i.e. GFI is not adequate to get the fuel transition going as quickly as is desirable. Therefore, a levy is needed to balance out the price differential between conventional and alternative fuels. Now, a number of Pacific SIDs and Caribbean islands, though again, I hasten to add, not all of them, but a number of them, see a levy as an essential primary mechanism and are arguing for a levy starting at $150 per ton CO2, so roughly $460, $470 per ton on conventional fuel. This is the primary mechanism that the IMO should agree and is intended to be the primary driver of change. They are either accepting of or supportive of a GFI, but most of them do not see a GFI as a primary mechanism. It is the market price that is going to be the driver for change in what shipping actually burns. And that's fine. Here we have two groups of countries that all are supportive of a levy for various reasons and at various price levels. And if it stopped there, it would be, of course, a smooth sailing for a levy in one form or the other. But we also have a number of developing countries. And these are major countries such as China, the entirety of South America, Africa, some African countries, some South Asian countries, Indonesia, India. We have Russia in the mix, saying essentially that a levy is a totally unacceptable tax on trade and is a non-starter. Again, one of those bright red lines that I mentioned. So we have what everybody recognizes is a majority of countries saying a levy is fine, but we have a very strong minority saying it is totally unacceptable. And the IMO does not make these kinds of decisions based on a majority vote. You need to reach consensus to actually get a decision on what should be part of the mechanism. So this is one of the really challenging issues that also need to be resolved. And we have to move fairly quickly on this because we need to have this sorted by the end of MEPC 82 in October. Not in having all regulatory text in place, but we need to have a broad framework agreement established so that we can hammer out the final regulatory text, start working on guidelines and other supporting documentation towards approval at MEPC 83 in April next year. So we're looking at roughly half a year of really tough negotiations in order to sort out all of these political issues. And for those who are diving deep into this matter, you will be able to see that there are some spaces here for compromises, potential compromises, but it means that pain has to be shared. Everybody has to be willing to give something in order to attain an agreement that we all can live with. Also underpinning all of this, we have an activity ongoing, a so-called comprehensive impact assessment that is intended to deliver its results prior to MEPC 82, looking at the socio-economic impacts of the various permutations of the various regulatory elements on the table. Essentially looking at costs on trade, costs on ships, costs on the nations, in order to inform the decision-making at MEPC 82. So again, as I hasten to repeat, it's extremely political. Even the so-called technical element the discussions is being driven by political consideration, but with a solid dollop of technical matters also thrown into the mix. Multiple moving parts and quite the challenging task to get all of this sorted in time. But when we step back a step or 10 and just look at the overarching business implications of what is going on at the IMO. No one is talking about rolling back anything. It's more that we are striving to find a way forward that everybody can come along on. So in that sense, we have our marching orders. We do know the course and speed of maritime decarbonization. 2050 sits out there as an ultimate decarbonization date, and there is no one is arguing that this is something that we need to restart rediscussing. We do know that the additional regulations are in the pipeline, and even though it looks extremely complex and tricky right now, generally speaking, the IMO here has been really good in the greenhouse gas space at keeping to the agreed timeline on the regulatory developments. So I have a pretty strong faith that the IMO will manage to stick with the timeline that they've already talked about a couple of times. The downside here is that regulatory complexity and overlap will increase, because none of what the IMO is doing is going to lead to, for instance, the EU immediately rolling back its regulations. We will be seeing increasing pressure for something like that happening as we get towards the end of this decade, but those processes will take time if they take place at all. So complexity, overlap will increase, compliance will become tougher, and compliance will become more tricky in simple terms. Seeing that all of this stuff is going to drive up energy prices because of the shift to more expensive fuels that will be driven by these regulations, energy efficiency improvements obviously remain important, both from a business perspective, but also for compliance perspective when it comes to certain regulations such as the CII, for instance. But we are seeing a steadily growing need for zero and near zero fuels, which means that land-based industry, infrastructure developments, all of those also need to accelerate quite quickly in order to satisfy the needs of the maritime industry. And in that sense, the certainty that these regulations will provide is essential, because they create the framework, the base conditions that make industry willing to invest in these, producing these fuels. And finally, in all of this, knowing and understanding your own emissions data will be business critical, because it's not only going to be about compliance, of course, it's also going to be about figuring out what the additional costs are when they are incurred and who the costs can be passed on to. So in that sense, knowing what you emit, where you emit it, and when you emit it is going to be absolutely crucial. With that, I think I will be passing over to Tore, and I will just hand over control to him. And away you go, Tore.
Thank you, Eric, and good day to all of you. So I will take you over from the more political overarching considerations on greenhouse gas matters and dive into the technical details, and also cover the other topics that were discussed at the IMO. So, starting with the life cycle guidelines. There we are. So these are quite important guidelines, because they are supporting the technical element, the greenhouse gas fuel standard. So this is the basis for how to calculate the well-to-wake or tank-to-wake and sustainability of fuels. The first version came at the last MEPC, and now there has been one revision, and of course there will be further revisions to this. It's not applied yet in any means. It's a it's an individual guideline, but of course the intention is that it will be applied later on. So what was discussed and updated at this stage was, first of all, the quantification of biofuel production parameters, meaning land use in particular, evaluation of electricity from greenhouse gas intensity, also the method for calculating the actual tank-to-wake emissions on board, and also a couple of default emission factors for some fuel pathways. There's a lot of work remaining, so the ongoing work will be split in two tasks, one done by a correspondence group, which will discuss the measurement and verification of tank-to-wake methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And the second is a scientific working group, which is going to do a peer review of the method and also go through the emission factors, the sustainability criteria, fuel certification, and also handling of onboard carbon capture. So this will also be done in a much smaller group than the correspondence group and the working group so far, but focusing more on the scientific aspects of these guidelines. Then we had, as Erik promised, I would cover the CII review. Not much to say there. There's no specific outcome on the CII. There was a proposal to issue a resolution which stated that the CII should not be used outside the context of the IMO, as it was in an experience building phase, it was an interim phase, and subject to a review. However, that resolution was not passed, arguing that the CII is not an interim measure, it is an operational measure. Yes, there is a review, but still it's not something that should be considered interim. That being said, there are a lot of proposals coming in for revising the CII. We are now in a data gathering phase, and then the analysis and the decisions will start at MEPC 82 this fall, and the decisions will be made by 83 late spring 2025. So that includes correction factors, voyage adjustments, new metrics, new reference lines, and so on, and also in particular a reduction requirement from 2026 to 2030, and also could be enforcement, and also whether the LCA guidelines will be applied. There will not be a discussion on aligning this with the other greenhouse gas measures that Erik just presented. We expect that these two will live in parallel for the first review. Later on, this might be aligned, but for the moment, the CII is intended to achieve the short-term carbon intensity target in 2030. Then a couple of other greenhouse gas related matters. There was finally a discussion on onboard carbon capture and storage. This had been postponed for quite a few sessions. There are two tracks in this work stream now. I already mentioned that the GESAMP working group will consider the method under the LCA guidelines. And then the second one is a correspondence group which will discuss the framework and come up with a work plan for how that could be progressed. So again, it's a general acceptance of applying carbon capture and looking at how the framework, different regulations, meaning the EDI, the XI, the CII, the life cycle guidelines and future requirements, and of course the safety aspect could be further developed. There were adopted amendments to the data collection system and related guidelines, so we now have a more granular reporting of fuel consumption, consumer type, meaning the main engines, the auxiliary engines, boilers, and others, and also reporting of transport work, meaning cargo carried. So instead of still continuing reporting the dead weight and the proxy of deadweight miles as transport work, but now we will also get the actual transport work reported. And this enters into force in mid-2025, so we expect 2026 the first reporting year, but there are provisions for early implementation in 2025 based on flags. There was an adoption of revised guidelines for overrideable shaft engine power limitation. For systems we do not physically limit the shaft and engine power and where the override is indicated by an alarm. So these provisions are now in line with what's stated in IAC's recommendation 172. And finally, there was a unified interpretation on the definition of heavy load carriers, which is important for these ships, as they are not included as general cargo carriers under the EDI, EXI, and CII framework. So this is also now in line with IAC's interpretation. Then moving over to other topics, ballast water, emission control areas, and MARPOL amendments, and also other amendments. Starting with ballast water management. First of all, IMO completed interim guidance for ships operating in challenging water quality conditions. And this indicates the steps how to identify challenging water quality, how to bypass the ballast water management system, and recovering from the bypass, returning to compliance, and planning, record keeping, and communication principles. There was also completion of a guidance for the temporary storage of treated sewage and grey water in ballast water tanks. And also, as part of the experience building phase of the Ballast Water Management Convention, IMO have now decided on the elements to be updated. And that includes, for example, guidance and updates to type approval, addition to the Ballast Water Management Plan, and also inclusion of biological compliance testing for ships at intermediate and renewal surveys. Then we are moving over to new emission control areas. So there were 2 new areas that were approved, and of course they're subject to adoption expected at MEPC 82. These are the Canadian Arctic and the Norwegian Sea, as indicated on the map here. Both include SOx, NOx, and particulate matters. The sulfur requirement, the 0.1 sulfur requirement, takes effect from 1st of March 2027 for both. And for the NOx requirement, Tier 3 requirement applies to ships constructed on or after 1st of January 2025 for the Canadian Arctic. And for ships contracted on or after 1st of March 2026 for the Norwegian Sea. In addition, for the Norwegian Sea, which is new for the NOx emission control areas, is that there are a time limit. Any ship delivered on or after 1st of March 2030, independent on contract and key laying date, will need to comply with Tier 3 when operating in the Norwegian Sea. Then we have adopted amendments. We have on MARPOL Annex 6, clarifying the definition of fuel oil and defining gas fuels in conjunction with the required information on flashpoint fuels in the bunker delivery notes. And Regulation 13 on accepting marine diesel engine as replacing steam systems as replacement engines. I already mentioned additional data elements to be reported through the data collection system on fuel consumption, consumer type, and transport work. And these 3 amendments enter into force 1st of August 2025. Amendment to the Ballast Water Management Convention, aligning it on the use of electronic record books, which was already in MARPOL. And this entered into force 1st of October 2025. And then finally, an amendment to Article 5 on MARPOL Protocol 1 on reporting in case of loss of freight containers, entering into force 1st of January 2026. So with that, I hand back to Simon for a little bit update on our resources and services, and then we will head over for the Q&A.
Thanks, Tora. As Tora said, in a few minutes or a few seconds, we'll be heading into the Q&A portion. So make sure to keep those questions coming in via the chat function, and we'll get to as many of those as we can in the time. In the meantime, I'd also like to direct your attention to many of the resources that we have online at the dnv.com website. So we have many of the other webinars on this style that you can access, including on other MEPC, greenhouse gas topics, decarbonisation, cybersecurity, and much, much more. So they are all there and freely available to download and access. As we said, this one you'll get the full recording, and there are other ones you can download on demand there from our webinars we've had in the last few years. We have our technical and regulatory newsletter, which you can sign up for and also download, which covers many of these topics as they come out. This is delivered to your inbox. So, for example, we already had a short write-up of the MEPC 81, which you could have read. We have many theme pages there, our publications, including our maritime impact stories, which look at many of the topics that where DNV is working, and a whole raft of services related to emissions information like the AFI, where you can see what's happening in the world of alternative fuels, or our alternative advisory services. We have a lot of that under our decarbonisation hub, which brings together a lot of these resources. So you can jump off from there and get many, many insights. So let's hop straight in to the Q&A. So I think one of the things we really want to start off at the start is, what do we know about the applicability of the GHG regulations, I reckon, Tora, in terms of the type and size of vessels that are going to be affected?
Well, we have not started discussing ship types, for instance, here, but you could expect applicability to essentially be the same as for any other greenhouse gas regulation. We're seeing the EDI, the EXI, the CI, etc. It will be a broad range of ship types. So what we are seeing is that there is a discussion ongoing with respect to size cutoffs. Traditionally, all of this has landed at 5,000 GT, but there is a pressure to push the limit down to 400 GT for the next generation of regulations. Not everybody's agreeing with that, obviously, but we shall see how that plays out as we get into. I would expect this to be a topic at MPC 82, to be honest, when we start putting the regulatory text into the framework arrangement.
Right. And the other thing that we had a lot of discussion on is the definition of zero or near zero fuels that will be part of the scheme. Who, and who, when, and why, and how are we going to get the definition, or what fuels will be covered under this zero and net zero regime?
It's an interesting question. We had some proposals coming into MPC 81, where some parties proposed making a 90% reduction from a baseline GFI value, being what was necessary to satisfy zero or near zero GHG labeling. No decisions made. I suspect we'll probably be revisiting that one at MPC 82 as well. I don't know, Tore, you were in a different working group than me. Did you see any inclination to discuss it immediately there, or is it just floating a bit?
No, it's floating a bit. And also, it depends on the need for actually defining this, because depending on how the mechanisms will pan out, it might not be a need for exactly defining this term either. So at least I didn't see any big effort to land this. Of course, there were proposals on the table, but it depends on how the mechanisms are led on.
I guess the labeling becomes important when we get essentially post 2030, and I'm always going to try to figure out, did it reach its 2030 goals or not? So maybe it's more a post fact than a pre fact kind of label that's in practical terms.
So moving back to one of the issues that we've discussed a lot, we have several proposals at the IMO on the table, but in terms of greenhouse gas regulations and fuel controls in the maritime realm, we also have other proposals in effect or ready to go into effect from the EU, and also I think maybe at an earlier stage from in the US. What do we think is likely to happen, or how are we going to be able to deal with the differences in the ETS, the EU trading schemes, and the fuel models from the EU and the US? How do we see the interaction between that and the IMO standards now going?
Yeah, I alluded to it in my kind of semi-wrap-up, in the sense that complexity and overlap will increase, because that's essentially what's going to happen, at least initially here. All of these regulations will be layered on top of each other. You will have to comply with all of those that are relevant to where you're trading. So heading into the EU, you will have the Fuel EU Maritime, you'll have the EU ETS, and then you'll have the IMO GFI and whatever economic instrument is associated with that, all stacked on top of each other. And it will be a bit complex, because even though the IMO GFI and the Fuel EU Maritime are conceptually similar, they will be calculating the numbers differently. So compliance with one does not automatically mean compliance with the other. The follow-up question to that one, of course, is when can we expect to start seeing some efforts being made towards simplification? People raising their hand and saying that, yes, maybe it's time for us to start mothballing things. I'm a bit pessimistic on that one, because I think that everybody wants to be sure that new regulations are actually doing the job before you get rid of the old ones, meaning that we will be well up towards 2030, I think, before we start to see any kind of mothballing discussions actually getting traction. I'd love for people to disagree with me and say that no, this is going to happen much more quickly, but I'm a bit pessimistic on this one, I'm afraid.
Tara?
No, I don't disagree. Supporting Eric, it's definitely something that will. It remains to be seen. I think it's the fuel standard is much, as it's very similar to Fuel EU Maritime. I think it's more likely to it's more comparable and maybe easier to mothball, but remains to be seen on greenhouse gas pricing and how that takes effect in IMO.
Yeah, we had a few questions about data and reporting in terms of the IMO DCS, and who is responsible for providing this data. What are the ways that we are going to be able to get this data off and submit it?
I'll leave that one for you, Tore. You were in the DCS discussions.
Yeah, you mean the? I assume it's meant the additional granularity of the data for not required by the DCS, and yeah, it's a good question. Exactly how depends, of course, on the monitoring methods that are available and how. On the configuration of the fuel system of the ship, how you can separate between the different consumer types. So that's definitely something that needs to be considered. So what's in the guidelines now is quite a wide range of options, how you can move from basically fuel flow meters and also tank soundings and split them into the different consumer types. So but again, it's the ship operator that's actually operates the ship, that is on board the ship, that's responsible for providing this data to the flag and IMO, and also through the verifier.
Yeah, there's no change in the responsibility with the increased granularity. The same people are stuck with a greater workload. Let's put it like that.
Moving on to one of the sort of more future focused topics, because we had a couple of questions around carbon capture. Where do we see that heading? Do we think this will extend the lifetime of the use of conventional fuels, and sort of what types of carbon capture and storage systems on board do we see coming through at the moment?
Yes, I think it definitely is something that's important in taking into account the expected shortage of other low emissions fuels like biofuels or e-fuels, which are also going to be expensive. So, and of course, the point is then that you can continue using the conventional fuels. So yes, that's definitely the implication of that. Yes, we see different systems. I'm not having a full overview there, but we see, of course, the post-combustion and pre-combustion capturing of carbon and CO2. So it remains to be seen which one of these, or maybe different types of solutions, will play out. We also seen that, for example, for ballast water as a completely different example, but there are different methods for achieving the same. So we'll see about that.
I think that we can mention that when it comes to carbon capture and storage, the discussions at the IMO so far, or at least at MEPC, did not really center on the various CO2 capture or carbon capture technologies that are available. It was more on laying out the framework for getting that work going, because there is an increasing sense of urgency when it comes to the need for having the regulatory framework that allows for these systems. But there was an interesting point, I think, repeatedly made by industry, that in regulations, words matter. And when we talk about CO2 capture, the point was made that that actually could be construed as being somewhat limiting, because some of the systems that are being talked about, they don't capture CO2, they capture carbon. And the representatives wanted to make sure that we didn't impose limitations through inadvertent phrasing in regulatory language. So I think the industry is actually quite forward-leaning here and looking at many different options, and not just conventional amine-based CO2 and liquefaction and all that stuff.
Thanks both. We've got a couple of more detailed questions maybe to go into based on the questions from our attendees here. Here's one. Will the comprehensive impact assessment look at the potential impact of the MTMs on lower carbon fuel supply and demand? I think this is also something that came up in terms of where we see the supply of whether we see the supply of low or zero carbon fuels being sufficient. The concern is that the financial impact of low carbon fuel cost in a tight market may be significantly higher than the cost impact of a levy.
Yes, so I kind of go into the details of the findings of the impact assessment that DNV is working on, but we will look into the issue of limited supply and implication on the fuel costs. So that will be coming in the next iterations of this report.
Let's have a look. Some questions on how the IMO might levy the levy, for example, if we have any insight into that.
Good wordplay. First off, I think the IMO actually needs to agree on whether or not we will have a levy. And despite so many coverage over the last month or so, both pre-meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting, it is by no means a given that we will get a levy, given the political issues that I described with essentially irresistible forces, immovable objects, etc., etc. The technical aspects of how a levy could be levied, that would be up for discussion. Some of it is laid out in various of the proposals. People are taking differing approaches to this. A core part of it would need to be some kind of a fund mechanism. That I think the general recognition is that would have to be run by the IMO. There's a very limited appetite to outsourcing it, even though there were proposals actually for outsourcing it by Canada, amongst others. But it's a little bit premature actually to start speculating on that, because we started to discuss flavor before we even decided if we want a soft drink, to be honest. Tore, you may have something to add on that one.
Yeah, it seems more likely that it will be the ship operator that's responsible for paying, and not the fuel supplier. But again, of course, we've had the discussions under EU ETS on who's responsible, whether that's the ship owner or whether that's the ship operator. Of course, we see the same discussion also taking place at the IMO. So again, I think that will be in the future, but I think it's more likely on the ship side rather than the fuel supply side.
Here's a question that we had popping up a little bit across. I think it has intrigued the attendees from both the webinars today. Is the how we think the opportunities of pooling may work within in practice. Do we have any indications there, or was there discussion about how this might take place?
We haven't gotten into the real technical details on the setup, though there are suggestions in the proposals, of course. For instance, I would suggest that the proposals from the EU would not surprisingly be close to what the EU is seeing in Fuel EU Maritime. That's gone through a process, so that would be a reasonable approximation. There will no doubt be discussions on should this be limited to to the same flag, to same ship types, sizes, same owners, and so on. But again, from my point of view at least, and feel free to differ to it, because this is subject to academic dispute, I think. I would suggest that a pool that is as flexible as possible will actually provide for the lowest overall compliance costs. So I would hope that the IMO goes that way, and if we get a pool mechanism going, and I think we will, that we have a great degree of flexibility in how that is actually put together.
Yeah. I think the issue of having the least cost option is one thing, but also that the fuel availability of various fuels may not be, or the low emission fuels may not be available in all locations. So it's important that this doesn't prevent the fleet from actually achieving the target, so that you can spread this compliance, so to speak, using a pooling mechanism. I think that will be very beneficial.
It's another relatively technical question around the reporting possibilities of being able to report actual emissions versus using carbon factors, if this is a possibility, and how I guess if you have beta sensors, then could this benefit you in some way?
I assume we are talking about direct CO2 measurements here, as opposed to fuel consumption multiplied by a carbon factor.
Mm-hmm.
It was briefly discussed. It was not really a part of the agenda at MEPC, but it was briefly discussed during discussions of the update of the SEMP and the methods. So it was recognized that the method in this described in the SEMP, which is a standalone chapter in the guidelines and not really used at all, needs to be updated. They are not really fit for purpose, and in particular taking into account that you now need to report per consumer type, and that would be very difficult when you look at what's just total that comes out of the funnel. So there is definitely a need for updating this, and also considering whether this is more accurate than taking the fuel consumption and multiplied by carbon factor also remains to be seen. So yeah, it's a little bit up in the air exactly how this will play out.
I guess we can mention also that, even though it's a little bit off topic, maybe that the EU will be struggling with the same matters essentially, because direct smokestack measurements are, of course, one of the metrics under the EU regulations as well. So this is more than just an IMO issue. It's broader.
Yeah.
So we've almost come to the end. Maybe we can squeeze in one or two questions. There is a question here about the discussion of on the ballast water compliance with the D2 standard, if this was discussed, in particular a report from Australia, submitted by Australia to MEPC 81.
I don't, neither me nor Tore were present during the ballast water discussions. We were focusing on other matters, so I don't think I'm in a position to answer that one. I'm afraid I don't have that overview, I'm sorry to say.
Fair enough. So let's take our last minute maybe to look ahead. We've had MEPC 81. MEPC 82 is, you know, the coming up, not too far ahead. What are we looking for from MEPC 82 as we head towards those discussions, as a way to wrap up what we've seen and what we can expect?
Well, I can start off with the GHG strategic stuff at least, and the shorter answer is more of the same, but with a much greater sense of urgency. There will be we'll be seeing the same discussions that we've been seeing, but as mentioned, we need to see resolution on an agreement, or at least conceptual agreement on what is going to be in the basket of measures. And we had some time now at the MEPC 81 to kind of explore our options. When we get to MEPC 82, we actually need to start getting those text pieces down in draft document form, which is why the framework we agreed at this meeting is so important, because that's going to facilitate getting all the bits and pieces in. Even if we don't have agreement on them, we'll be able to see them in parallel and try to make it all fit together as a single functioning machine. So that, I think that's the strategic important thing there. But then we have some lots of other significant things that are going to be happening at 82 as well. Touching on what Tore talked about, I think I'll hand that over to you, Tore, to touch on.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, the life cycle guidelines will, of course, continue. Although I think the GESAMP working group will not come with results before MEPC 83 next spring. But there are a lot of other things. We'll kick off the CII review, which remains to be seen how much will be discussed at MEPC. But of course, the review will start and the analysis will conclude at MEPC 83. And of course, a lot of things will need to get started based on the new greenhouse gas regulations that have been discussed. So there are a lot of underlying guidelines that needs to be worked on. So I guess that will also start. So a lot of kicking off, sense of urgency, a little bit of panic, kicking off things, incredibly busy. Sounds like a very interesting meeting.
Interesting is the right word to wrap it all up on, I think.
Absolutely. Well, we've got to now the end of the webinar. Don't panic about that, because you will be able to watch it again. We'll be sending out the link and the presentations in the next coming days. I'd like to thank you, both of our presenters, and of course you for attending. If you're interested in other DNV content, head over to the website. You can check out even webinars there as well. I'm sure we'll be back to revisiting this topic very, very soon. Thank you again for attending. Take care, and we hope to see you all at our next webinar.